A grieving mother, a black woman whose only son was gunned down in the street by a corrupt police force that saw him as nothing more than a suspect based on the color of his skin. They assumed the incident would fade into the endless cycle of forgotten cases, buried under excuses and denials. But they underestimated the fire that loss ignites in a mother's heart. One by one, those responsible would face the unyielding force of her retribution, a justice born from pain that no system could contain. What unfolds is a pursuit through the underbelly of power and prejudice, culminating in a confrontation that echoes the cries of countless unheard voices. The afternoon sky hung heavy with the threat of rain, casting a dull gray pall over the narrow streets of the urban neighborhood where Angela Hayes had raised her son. Jamal, amid the constant hum of city life and the unspoken rules that governed survival for black families like theirs. Angela was in her small kitchen, stirring a pot of soup that filled the air with the comforting aroma of onions and herbs, when her phone buzzed sharply on the counter, an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. She answered with a cautious hello, her voice steady from years of working as a community organizer. But the words on the other end shattered that composure like glass underfoot. A frantic voice gasping that there had been a shooting on the corner of Elm and Fifth, and it involved her son. Her heart plummeted, the spoon slipping from her fingers into the pot as she grabbed her keys and bolted out the door, her mind racing with denial even as her body propelled her forward. The drive felt eternal, each red light a cruel delay, the blare of horns around her fading into a distant roar as images of Jamal flashed unbidden, his gap-toothed grin as a child. The way he'd tower over her now as a young man full of dreams about becoming an engineer. Arriving at the scene, she slammed the car door and pushed through the gathering crowd, her eyes locking on to the horrific sight. Jamal sprawled on the cracked sidewalk, blood pooling around him, his chest riddled with bullet holes that spoke of overkill, while a cluster of white police officers stood nearby, their postures relaxed, radios crackling with indifferent chatter. Angela dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she cradled his head, whispering his name over and over, begging him to hold on, but his eyes were already glazing over, the life ebbing away in shallow, ragged breaths. One officer, a burly man with a mustache, glanced down and muttered something about procedure, his tone laced with impatience, as if Jamal's dying was an inconvenience to their shift. Rage bubbled beneath her grief, but she choked it back, focusing on her son's face, smoothing his braids with fingers stained red, willing him to fight just a little longer. The ambulance arrived too late, sirens wailing like a mocking lament, paramedics rushing in with stretchers and equipment, but their efforts were perfunctory. A quick check of vitals confirming what Angela already knew in her bones: her boy was gone, taken by bullets fired without warning, without reason beyond the suspicion that clung to young black men like a shadow. As they loaded his body, she clung to the stretcher's edge, her sobs raw and unfiltered, the crowd murmuring sympathies mixed with warnings about not provoking the cops further. At the hospital, the sterile white walls and the sharp scent of antiseptic assaulted her senses as she followed the gurney down the corridor, nurses parting like waves before her unyielding stride. In the emergency room, a doctor with weary eyes approached, his clipboard clutched like a shield, informing her in clinical terms that Jamal had sustained multiple gunshot wounds to the torso, a damage too extensive for survival, inflicted by police-issue firearms during what they claimed was a routine stop turned volatile. Angela's world narrowed to those words, her mind rebelling against them. Flashing back to Jamal's childhood, the afternoons he'd spent kicking a soccer ball in the park, his laughter echoing off the chain-link fences, or the evenings he'd pore over homework at the kitchen table, determined to break the cycle of poverty that had ensnared so many in their community. He wasn't a criminal. He was a student, a dreamer, someone who volunteered at the local youth center, Yet here he lay under a sheet, reduced to a statistic in the ongoing epidemic of police violence against black lives. The doctor offered condolences, but they rang hollow, and as Angela signed the paperwork with numb fingers, she felt a seed of something darker take root amid the devastation of resolve to uncover the truth, to make them pay for stealing her future. Leaving the hospital, the night air bit at her skin, but she barely noticed, driving home in a fog. The empty passenger seat, a gaping void where Jamal should have been joking about her cooking. Inside her modest apartment, the walls seemed too close in, photos of Jamal at various ages staring back from the shelves his first bike ride. Graduation from high school. The proud smile when he got his college acceptance letter. She collapsed onto the couch, tears flowing freely now in the privacy of her grief. But soon, anger sharpened the edges, propelling her to action. The next morning, after a sleepless night haunted by visions of the shooting, Angela requested the official police report, poring over it at her kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee forgotten beside her. The document was a masterpiece of evasion, describing the incident as a justified use of force against a suspected armed individual who allegedly reached for his waistband. But there was no mention of a weapon found, no body cam footage referenced. Just vague assertions that painted Jamal as the aggressor. Disgust roiled in her stomach. This was the system at work, whitewashing brutality to protect its own. As she sat there, a soft knock at the door startled her, a young woman from the neighborhood. Someone Jamal had known from school, slipping inside with wide eyes and a hushed voice. She revealed herself as a witness, hidden behind a parked car. During the stop, describing how the officers had pulled Jamal over for a broken taillight, escalating immediately with drawn guns, shouting accusations of drug possession without cause, and firing when he raised his hands in surrender, mistaking his phone for a threat. The woman handed Angela a crumpled note with the names of the involved officers: Sergeant Mark Riley, the one who pulled the trigger, backed by officers Lena Torres and Chief Daniel Voss, who had overseen the cover-up. Fear etched her features as she warned Angela to be careful, but the information ignited a fire. Angela thanked her quietly, promising discretion, and after the door closed, she began compiling a list in a worn notebook, each name etched with deliberate strokes. A blueprint for the justice the courts would never deliver. Days blurred into a haze of morning preparations, the community rallying with casseroles and cards. But Angela moved through it like a ghost. Her thoughts fixated on the betrayal inherent in a badge that promised protection but delivered death based on skin tone. The funeral arrived under a sky heavy with unshed rain. The church packed with friends, family, and activists who knew Jamal's story was far from unique. Angela stood by the open casket, her black dress feeling like armor, gazing at her son's peaceful face, the makeup hiding the pallor of death, but not the injustice that had caused it. Mourners filed past, offering hugs and whispers of solidarity. Stories of Jamal's kindness rippling through the air like an unspoken eulogy. When Sergeant Riley appeared, dressed in full uniform as if to assert authority even here, Angela's blood turned to ice. He extended a hand with feigned sympathy, murmuring platitudes about duty and tragedy. But she stared through him, refusing the touch, her voice cutting like a blade as she said, "You murdered my son for existing while black." The room tensed. Whispers spreading, but Riley withdrew awkwardly, his facade cracking under her unblinking gaze. The service proceeded with hymns that soared but failed to lift her spirit. The pastor speaking of forgiveness while Angela's mind churned with visions of accountability. The systemic racism that allowed such killings to recur without repercussion. As they lowered Jamal into the earth at the cemetery, the soil thumping dully on the coffin, Angela felt the weight of generations of black mothers who had buried their children too soon. From Emmett Till to Trayvon Martin, a lineage of loss that fueled her transformation. Back at the reception in the church basement, amid plates of fried chicken and potato salad, conversations turned to protests and calls for reform. But Angela slipped away early, craving solitude. At home, she sat in Jamal's room, surrounded by his posters of inventors and stacks of textbooks, the scent of his cologne lingering faintly. Grief twisted into fury as she contemplated the broader picture, the disproportionate stops, the biased training, the blue wall of silence that shielded killers in uniform. She realized then that waiting for change from within was futile. The system was designed to perpetuate inequality, to view black bodies as threats rather than humans. In that quiet space, illuminated only by a desk lamp, Angela's decision crystallized not impulsive vengeance, but a calculated dismantling of those who had dismantled her world. She added details to her list. Riley's shift patterns gleaned from online forums, Torres's social media hints at family life, Wass's public appearances. The notebook became her confidant, pages filling with observations on how racism embedded itself in everyday policing, from profiling to lethal force disparities. Hours turned to nights as she researched similar cases, joining online groups of bereaved families. Their stories mirroring hers in heartbreaking details sopped for fitting a description. Daughters harassed until tragedy struck. One account particularly struck her, a mother in a nearby city whose boy was choked during an arrest. The officer swat-led despite video evidence, highlighting the impunity that bred boldness. Angela's awakening deepened. This wasn't just personal. It was epidemic, a war on black existence masked as law enforcement. She vowed silently to honor Jamal by exposing and eradicating the rot, starting with those directly responsible. Sleep evaded her, but purpose sustained her, a quiet strength emerging from the ashes of despair. Mornings brought routine distractions: work, calls from her organizing job, where colleagues offered support but couldn't fathom the depth of her rage. But evenings were for planning, mapping routes on her phone, noting patrol cars in the neighborhood. A chance encounter at the grocery store with an old friend, a retired cop who had left the force in disgust over corruption, provided insider tips on departmental politics, confirming Voss's role in suppressing investigations. Angela absorbed it all, her demeanor calm to outsiders, but internally a storm brewed, tempered by the wisdom of ancestors who had resisted enslavement and segregation. She thought of Harriet Tubman leading through darkness and drew parallels to her path ahead. The neighborhood buzzed with rumors of the shooting, some fearing retaliation, others organizing marches. But Angela kept her intentions hidden, knowing isolation was key to success. As she closed the notebook one night, the city's lights twinkling outside her window, she felt a profound shift, no longer just a grieving mother, but a force of reckoning, ready to challenge the narrative that black lives were expendable. The air in the room seemed charged, the silence pregnant with possibility. And for the first time since Jamal's death, Angela allowed a faint, resolute smile to touch her lips, a harbinger of the justice she would forge with her own hands. Memories flooded in waves. Jamal's first steps in their cramped living room, his excitement over science fairs where he'd build volcanoes from baking soda, the pride in his voice when he spoke of scholarships that would take him beyond the projects. These weren't just recollections, they were fuel, reminders of what was stolen not just from her, but from a community starved of opportunity. Angela's research expanded, delving into statistics on police shootings, the stark racial disparities that made black men exponentially more likely to die at the hands of law enforcement, and reports from organizations like the ACLU detailing patterns of bias in traffic stops and use of force incidents. She clipped articles, saved screenshots, and built a mental arsenal against the denial she knew would come. Conversations with other mothers and support groups revealed shared traumas: sons lost to accidental discharges, daughters to excessive restraint, each story layering onto her resolve like bricks in a wall. One woman, elderly and frail, shared how her grandson was beaten during a protest, the officers laughing as they walked away free. It mirrored Angela's pain, amplifying it into a collective cry for change. Yet Angela knew protests alone hadn't saved Jamal. Direct action was necessary, a personal revolution against institutional evil. She practiced mindfulness to steady her nerves, breathing exercises learned from yoga classes Jamal had dragged her to, channeling grief into clarity. The list grew annotated. Riley's habit of frequenting a dive bar after shifts, Therese's weekend jogs in the park, Voss's golf outings. With city officials, subtle surveillance began driving past the precinct, noting license plates, using binoculars from afar to avoid detection. Paranoia crept in occasionally, wondering if she was being watched, but she dismissed it, focusing on the end game. Community. Events became opportunities for intel. At a vigil for another victim, she overheard whispers about internal affairs, looking the other way on complaints. This confirmed her path. No trust in the system, only in her ability to disrupt it. Nights ended with her staring at Jamal's photo on her nightstand, whispering promises of vengeance, sleep finally claiming her in fitful bursts. Awakening brought renewed vigor, a sense of empowerment amid the sorrow, as if Jamal's spirit urged her onward. She volunteered more at the youth center, channeling energy into mentoring kids like him, teaching them about rights and self-defense, all while plotting. In secret, the duality exhausted her, but it also sharpened her, turning a broken woman into a strategist. Reflections on broader society haunted her: how media portrayed victims as thugs, how juries acquitted killers, how politicians paid lip service to reform without action. Angela's awakening was complete. This fight was for Jamal, but also for every black child navigating a world rigged against them. As she sealed the notebook in a drawer, the decision solidified: no turning back. Only forward into the shadows where true justice awaited. The transformation felt visceral, her body adapting to the weight of intent, muscles tensing with anticipation. She imagined the officers' faces when confronted, the fear mirroring what Jamal must have felt in his final moments. It wasn't hatred driving her, but equity, a balancing of scales tipped for centuries. With each passing day, the plan took shape. Intricate and unforgiving, a testament to a mother's unbreakable bond. Angela Hayes was no longer defined by loss. She was reborn through it, a guardian of memory poised to strike. The city pulsed around her, oblivious to the storm brewing in one woman's heart. But soon, the ripples would spread, challenging the foundations of power and prejudice that had claimed too many lives. In this genesis of retribution, Angela found not peace, but purpose, a light in the darkness that Jamal's death had cast. And so, the chapter of grief closed, giving way to one of calculated defiance, where a black mother's love became the most formidable weapon against injustice. In the wake of her awakening, Angela Hayes knew that raw emotion alone wouldn't suffice. She needed expertise, a guide through the murky waters of surveillance and evasion that the system itself had perfected. Her mind turned to Marcus Kane, a former black cop she'd met years ago during a community outreach event. A man who'd been drummed out of the force for blowing the whistle on internal corruption, falsified reports, planted evidence, and the unchecked racism that permeated precinct walls. Marcus had transitioned into private investigation, operating from a dingy office in a strip mall on the city's fringes, where the neon signs flickered like dying hopes. Angela drove there under a sky bruised with impending dusk, her hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary, rehearsing her words to avoid sounding desperate. The office smelled of stale coffee and printer ink, walls lined with faded certificates, and news clippings of cases he'd cracked on his own. Marcus looked up from his desk, his salt-tanned pepper beard framing a face etched with the lines of too many betrayals, and recognized her instantly. "Angela Hayes," he said, his voice gravelly, but warm. "Didn't expect to see you here. This is about Jamal." She nodded, sitting across from him, and poured out the story, not just the shooting, but the cover-up, the witness's testimony, the list burning a hole in her notebook. Marcus listened without interruption, his eyes narrowing at mentions of Riley, Torres, and Voss, names he knew all too well from his time inside. "The blue wall is thicker than you think," he warned, leaning forward, "but it's got cracks if you know where to hit." He agreed to help, not for money, but because he'd lost a nephew to similar circumstances years back, a wound that never healed. Over the next few evenings, they met in his office or neutral spots like a quiet diner off the highway, where the clatter of plates masked their conversations. Marcus taught her the basics of tailing without detection-varying routes, using mirrors to spot followers, blending into crowds by altering posture and clothing. He emphasized discretion. "You're not invisible, but you can be forgettable." Angela absorbed it like a sponge, practicing in her daily life, following strangers on errands to hone her skills, noting how people moved predictably when they felt safe. He introduced her to the underground market for untraceable tools, connecting her with a discreet contact in a back-alley garage who sold her a compact handgun with a suppressor, its matte finish absorbing light like a void. "Practice in the woods," Marcus advised. "Feel the weight, the recoil, until it's an extension of you." Angela did just that, driving to a remote forested area outside town, setting up cans on logs and firing until her ears rang despite the earplugs. Each shot a release of pent-up fury, but controlled, methodical. She visualized Riley's face on those targets, the man who'd pulled the trigger on Jamal without a second thought. His smug demeanor at the funeral replaying in her mind like a looped video. Back home, she stashed the gun in a locked box under her bed, alongside the notebook, now filled with sketches of Riley's routine. Surveillance began in earnest. Angela parked her car in inconspicuous spots near the precinct. A nondescript sedan she'd borrowed from a cousin to avoid recognition. Riley was a creature of habit, finishing late shifts around midnight, then heading to a dimly lit bar called O'Malley's, a cop hangout where badges meant free drinks and blind eyes. She watched from across the street, binoculars hidden in her lap, noting how he laughed with buddies, downing whiskeys until his steps wobbled on the way out. His drive home took him through quiet suburbs, a route with poorly lit stretches where houses sat far back from the road. Angela mapped at all blind corners, streetlight gaps, even the timing of traffic patterns using apps on her phone for satellite views, annotating printouts with potential ambush points. Marcus reviewed her notes, suggesting adjustments. Hit him close to home. Makes it personal, harder for them to spin as random. She delved deeper into Riley's life, hacking lightly into public records via library computers, married, 2 kids, a mortgage on a split-level house with a backyard swing set. It humanized him momentarily, stirring a flicker of doubt. But then she'd remember Jamal's lifeless eyes. The way the officers had joked while his blood cooled on the pavement and the hesitation vanished. Preparation extended to her cover. Angela altered her appearance subtly, wigs from a thrift store, oversized coats to change her silhouette, even practicing accents in the mirror to deflect questions. Marcus shared stories from his pie days, cases where he'd tailed cheating spouses or embezzling executives, emphasizing patience, rush it, and you're done. Angela applied this to her observations, spending nights in her car with thermos coffee, listening to podcasts on racial injustice to fuel her resolve. Episodes detailing the history of policing from slave patrols to modern militarization, reinforcing that Riley wasn't an anomaly, but a symptom. One evening, as rain began to sheet down, Angela decided it was time. The forecast promised a deluge, perfect for masking sounds and footprints. She dressed in dark layers, waterproof boots, silent. On wet ground, the gun tucked securely in a holster under her jacket. Driving to Riley's neighborhood, she parked 3 blocks away in a cul-de-sac. Walking the rest with her hood up, the storm's roar drowning her approach. His house loomed, lights on in the living room where shadows moved his family, perhaps. Watching TV, oblivious. Angela waited in the shrubbery across the street. Rain soaking through, but ignored. Her focus laser-sharp. Riley's cruiser pulled in around 1 a.m. Headlights cutting through the downpour as he stumbled slightly toward the door, keys jingling. She emerged from the shadows, voice cutting clear despite the tempest. Mark Riley. He spun, hand instinctively. To his hip, where his service weapon usually sat. But off-duty, he was unarmed. Recognition dawned slowly in his rain-slicked face. "Who the hell are you?" he slurred. But Angela stepped closer, the gun already drawn, suppressor gleaming wetly. "You killed Jamal Hayes, my son, for nothing but fear and hate." His eyes widened. Excuses tumbling out, protocol, threat perception. The lies they drilled into reports, but she silenced him with a steady gaze. The trigger pull smooth, the muffled report lost in thunder. Riley crumpled against his garage door, life draining with the rivulets of water, and Angela felt a hollow echo, not joy, but necessity fulfilled. She wiped the gun with a gloved hand, though ballistics were untraceable, and slipped away, footsteps erased by the flood. Back home, she stripped in the bathroom, clothes into a trash bag for later disposal. Showering until the water ran clear, steam fogging the mirror where her reflection stared back, unchanged yet profoundly altered. Sleep came fitfully. Dreams. Of Jamal smiling, interspersed with Riley's fall. But morning brought news alerts on her phone. Off-duty officer slain in apparent targeted hit. Department vowing swift justice. Irony twisted her lips. Their justice had failed Jamal. Now they'd taste its absence. The precinct buzzed with paranoia. Officers doubling up on patrols, eyes darting at shadows. Whispers of a vigilante circulating in locker rooms. Angela watched. From afar, attending a community meeting where activists decried the violence but privately nodded at the poetic balance. Emboldened, she shifted focus to Officer Lena Torres, the one who'd helped fabricate the report, claiming Jamal had lunged. Aggressively, her testimony sealing the cover-up. Torres was different, sharper, more vigilant since Riley's death. Varying her routines, but Angela, with Marcus's guidance, peeled back layers. Torres lived in an apartment complex downtown, single, with a gym habit and weekend visits to a sister's house in the suburbs. Surveillance required finesse. Angela posed as a jogger in the nearby park, earbuds in but listening to nothing, noting Torres's evening runs along a wooded trail, isolated after dark. Marcus provided binoculars with night vision, allowing distant observation without risk. She learned Torres's vulnerabilities post-shift stops at a coffee shop, flirtations with a barista, and a predictable unwind. Planning evolved. Not a home hit this time to avoid patterns, but luring her to the park under pretenses. Angela crafted a note, anonymous, slipped under Torres's wiper. Know what happened to Riley. Meet at the park bench by the Oaks tonight. 10 p.m., or it finds you. Risky, but calculated to draw her out alone. Curiosity overriding caution. The night arrived clear and crisp, stars piercing the urban haze. Angela arriving early to scout. Hidden in foliage with the gun ready. Torres appeared wary, flashlight sweeping, hand near her concealed carry. But Angela emerged silently behind her. Lena Torres, she intoned, gun leveled. Torres whirled, drawing her weapon, but Angela's shot came first, precise to the shoulder. Disarming without killing instantly. You lied for them, covered the murder of an innocent black boy because it was easier than the truth. Torres gasped, pleading about orders, systemic pressure, but Angela's voice hardened. Invoking the ghosts of Tamir Rice, Philando Castile names symbolizing the epidemic. The final shot echoed softly, Torres slumping against the bench, eyes accusatory in death. Angela arranged the scene subtly, leaving a small Black Lives Matter pin nearby. Not as a signature, but a message to the force. This was about accountability, not randomness. Retreating through the trees, heart pounding now from adrenaline, she drove home circuitously, disposing of gloves in a distant dumpster. The kill felt different, less personal than Riley's, more symbolic of the complicity that enabled killers. News exploded the next day, second officer down. Links suspected to anti-police sentiment, protests flaring as communities divided between fear and quiet approval. Angela updated her notebook, crossing Torres's name with a firm line, reflecting on the strength drawn from her ancestors' resilience, enslaved women who poisoned masters, civil rights icons who marched into fire hoses. Marcus called, voice tense. They're ramping up, be ghosts, she assured him, but internally, power surged. She was no longer a victim, but the architect of change. Deeper dives into history fueled her reading about the Black Panther parties. Community patrols, how they armed against police brutality, mirroring her path in modern form. Community whispers reached her, some suspected an insider, others a grieving relative, but Angela stayed invisible. Volunteering more to maintain normalcy, organizing drives for body cams and reform, irony lost on no one. Doubts crept in during quiet moments, what if caught? What of her soul? But Jamal's memory banished them, his potential snuffed out for existing while black, demanding a response. Preparation for Voss intensified, but for now, satisfaction in 2 strikes lingered, a testament to a mother's unyielding love weaponized against hate. Angela's world narrowed, yet expanded, each breath purposeful, the list shortening as her legend. Unspoken, grew in shadowed alleys. She pondered the broader fight. One woman's war couldn't end racism, but it could ignite conversations, force reckonings in boardrooms and precincts. Sleep brought visions of Jamal, proud, urging continuation. And upon waking, resolve hardened like steel. The chapter of initial strikes closed with Angela at her window, city lights mocking the darkness within. Ready for the pinnacle, yet savoring the momentum built from preparation to execution, with the precinct now a fortress of paranoia. Officers, patrolling in armored vests, even on routine calls and internal memos circulating about potential insider threats. Angela Hayes understood that targeting Chief Daniel Voss would demand not just precision, but ingenuity. A dance through the tightening. News of surveillance that encircled the department like barbed wire. Voss was the linchpin, the white man at the helm who'd orchestrated the symphony of silence around Jamal's death, signing off on falsified reports that labeled her son a non-compliant suspect, and quashing any whisper of an independent investigation, all while posing for press conferences with a paternalistic frown, decrying violence in the streets as if his own hands weren't stained with the blood of black youth. Angela saw him not as a monster in isolation, but as the embodiment of a rotten core. A system where promotions came from protecting the badge over people, where racism was policy disguised as protocol. Marcus Kane, her steadfast ally, dug deeper than ever, leveraging old contacts in City Hall to uncover Voss's vulnerabilities, a secluded cabin retreat he escaped to on long weekends. Far from the urban sprawl, where he fished alone at dawn and reviewed case files by a wood-burning stove. Convinced his rank made him untouchable. The cabin sat on a wooded lake an hour north, accessible by a winding dirt road flanked by dense pines that whispered secrets in the wind. its isolation both a shield and a trap. Angela studied satellite maps obsessively, tracing paths through the underbrush, noting deer trails that could serve as silent approaches, and practicing night hikes in similar terrain to build her endurance. Her breaths measured against the crunch of leaves underfoot. Marcus warned her of the risks. Voss might have off-the-grid security, motion sensors, or hidden cameras, but Angela countered with countermeasures jamming devices sourced from his network, thermal blankets to mask her heat signature, and a commitment to strike when the moon was new, plunging the woods into inky blackness. Preparation became a ritual. Her days filled with mundane cover-organizing community workshops on police accountability, where she spoke passionately about reform without revealing the blade she wielded in Shido, and nights devoted to simulation, role-playing confrontations in her mirror, scripting words that would force Voss to confront the humanity he'd denied Jamal. She reflected on the evolution of her grief, how it had morphed from a crushing wave into a sharpened arrow, guided by the collective pain of Black America. Stories of Breonna Taylor's no-knock raid, George Floyd's plea for breath, Ahmaud Arbery's fatal jogich, a thread in the tapestry of systemic terror that Voss perpetuated. Doubt visited less frequently now, replaced by a philosophical certainty. If the law was a tool of oppression, then extra-legal justice was the equalizer, a reclamation of power for the powerless. The night she chose was starless and chill, autumn. Leaves carpeting the ground and rustling layers that muffled her approach as she drove north. Headlights off for the final miles, navigating by memory and a dim GPS glow. Parking a mile out in a forgotten logging pull-off, she shouldered a backpack with essentials water, the suppressed handgun, wire cutters for any fences, and melted into the forest, her black attire blending with the trunks like a specter, born of the earth. The air carried the crisp scent of pine resin and damp soil. Nocturnal creatures stirring but falling silent at her passage, as if sensing the gravity of her intent. Reaching the cabin's perimeter after a tense hour, she crouched behind a fallen log, observing through binoculars. Voss's SUV parked crookedly, a single light flickering in the window where he sat hunched over papers, a glass of bourbon catching the firelight. No visible alarms, just the arrogance of solitude. Angela circled slowly, cutting a loose wire she suspected was a perimeter alert, her gloved hand steady despite the adrenaline humming in her veins. The back door was unlocked, hubris again, and she slipped inside like smoke, the warmth of the interior contrasting with the outer cold, the smell of burning logs mingling with aged whiskey. Voss didn't hear her until she was in the room, gun raised, voice a low thunder. Daniel Voss. He jolted, papers scattering, his chair scraping as he turned, face paling in the fire's glow. "Who are you? How did you?" But recognition flickered. As she stepped into light, her features etched with the same unyielding sorrow he'd dismissed at press briefings. Jamal Hayes' mother. The boy you let your men execute and then buried under lies. Voss's hands rose slowly, eyes darting to a desk drawer where she knew a revolver waited, but she shook her head, the gun's barrel unwavering. He tried negotiation, voice oily with authority. "This isn't justice, it's murder. We can talk, investigate properly." Angela cut him off, her words a torrent of indictment, recounting the stop. The unfounded suspicion rooted in racial profiling. The barrage of bullets into an unarmed body, the doctored autopsy implying drugs where toxicology showed none. She spoke of the broader plague how chiefs like him fostered cultures of impunity, training officers to see black skin as a weapon. Budgets bloated for militarized gear, while communities starved for education and jobs. Voss stammered defenses, budget constraints, union protections, the dangers officers faced. But each rang hollow, excuses from a man who'd never known the terror of a traffic stop turning deadly. Angela's trigger finger itched, but she prolonged. the moment forcing him to acknowledge the names of other victims under his watch. The lawsuits settled quietly, and the promotions for killers. Tears welled in his eyes, fear, not remorsened, as he lunged for the drawer. She fired, the shot precise to the chest, his body slumping forward onto the desk, bourbon spilling like blood. In the aftermath, Angela arranged a subtle marker. A printed photo of Jamal smiling in his college sweatshirt. Tucked into Voss's limp hand, a silent accusation for whoever found him. She exited as she'd entered, vanishing into the woods, the cabin's light receding like a dying star. The drive back was a blur of winding roads and flashing memories on Spurth. His first words, the way he'd hug her after tough days organizing against evictions. Arriving home at dawn, she burned her clothes in the backyard barrel, the flames consuming evidence as the sun crested, casting long shadows across the yard. News broke by midday. Police chief assassinated in remote cabin, department in disarray. Federal agents called in amid fears of a serial avenger. Protests erupted anew, chants of no justice, no peace echoing through the streets. While media speculated on motives, some outlets finally delving into Jamal's case, unearthing discrepancies. In the report that Angela's actions had spotlighted, she watched from her living room, a cup of tea cooling untouched, feeling the weight lift incrementally, not in euphoria, but in quiet validation. The system cracked. Conversations ignited about defunding, community oversight, the deep-seated bias woven into badges. Marcus called once, cryptic. "It's done. Lay low." But Angela knew the hunt for her would intensify. Fingerprints absent, but suspicions swirling around grieving families. She contemplated flight, a new identity in a distant city, but discarded it. This was her home, scarred as it was, and fleeing would dishonor Jamal's memory. Instead, she immersed herself in reflection, wandering the park where Jamal had played as a child. Benches etched with graffiti of resistance, leaves swirling in eddies that mirrored her thoughts. Grief revisited, softer now, laced with pride, in her son's legacy and her role in amplifying it. She pondered the moral calculus. Had she become what she despised, a killer in the name of justice? Yet philosophy offered solace. Thinkers like Frantz Fanon on violence as a cleanser against colonial oppression. Audre Lorde's rage as a tool for survival. Her actions weren't vengeance, but reclamation. A black woman's assertion that enough was enough, echoing the defiance of Sojourner Truth or Angela Davis. Community responses varied. Some hailed her anonymously as a hero in online forums. Others decried the cycle of violence. But Angela saw progress in the debates. City Council meetings hastily convened to discuss reforms. Body cams mandated, and implicit bias training expanded. Personal toll emerged in solitude nights, staring at ceilings, questioning if Jamal would approve, but visions of him nodding in dreams assuaged doubts. She organized discreetly now, funneling energy into youth programs, teaching self-advocacy, with veiled references to her path, empowering the next generation against the beasts that had claimed her son. The notebook, all names crossed, became a relic. Stored in a box with Jamal's belongings, his favorite book on engineering. A worn baseball cap, symbols of what was and what could have been. As winter approached, frost etching windows like fragile art, Angela found a fragile piece. Walking neighborhood streets where murals of Jamal now adorned walls. His face immortalized in vibrant colors, a beacon for change. She engaged in therapy covertly, unpacking layers of trauma, acknowledging the scars her quest had left, but emerging stronger, a testament to resilience. Broader implications loomed. Her story, though unspoken, rippled nationally, inspiring. Investigations into similar cases, documentaries probing police accountability, and books on maternal grief turning activist. Angela Hayes became a legend in whispers, the mother who fought back, challenging narratives that black pain was inevitable. In quiet moments by the window, the city hums below. She contemplated legacy not as a vigilante, but as a catalyst, proving one person's resolve could bend the arc toward justice. The fight continued, not with guns, but words and actions, honoring Jamal by ensuring no other mother endured her hell. And in that evolution, from avenger to advocate, Angela discovered redemption, a light piercing the darkness that had once consumed her, illuminating paths for others to follow. The end wasn't closure, but continuation. A mother's love eternal, reshaping worlds one defiant step at a time. Reflections deepened as seasons shifted, spring buds symbolizing renewal. Angela volunteering at shelters, sharing stories of loss without confession, fostering solidarity among marginalized voices. She read voraciously Malcolm X on self-defense, Michelle Alexander on mass incarceration, reinforcing that her path, though extreme, addressed failures of passive resistance in a system deaf to pleas. Community healed alongside her, vigils turning into action groups, petitions gathering signatures. For civilian review boards, the chief's death a pivot point, exposing cracks. Personal growth manifested in small ways, cooking Jamal's favorite meals for neighbors, planting a garden in his memory, flowers blooming defiantly against concrete. Doubts lingered: what if escalation bred more violence? But data showed otherwise. Shootings dipping as scrutiny rose, officers hesitating where once they'd acted rashly. Angela's anonymity held, investigations stalling on a lack of leads, her meticulousness paying off. Marcus faded into the background, a nod in passing confirming mutual respect. She traveled once to a conference on racial justice, absorbing panels on restorative practices, pondering if forgiveness could coexist with accountability. Concluding it could, but only after truth. Returning home, the city felt transformed. Murals multiplying, Jamal's eyes watching over streets now patrolled. With caution, in solitude, she wrote letters to Jamal, sealed and burned, releasing words into the ether. Apologies for the world he inherited, pride in his spirit guiding her. Peace settled gradually, a mosaic of acceptance and activism. Angela emerging not broken, but forged anew. The narrative closed not with triumph's fanfare, but quiet resolve, a black mother's odyssey from despair to defiance, echoing eternally in the fight for equity.